This is a CBS News special report. Nixon, the next 4 years. The Correspondence Report. Here in New York are Walter Cronkite, Eric Sevareid, Dan Rather, and Daniel Shore, and Charles Collingwood in Paris.
Good evening. In a little less than 2 weeks, President Nixon will be inaugurated for his second term, as we all know. Well, certainly none of us is a seer. There are no occult powers here, as far as I know, at this table or over in Paris either, Charles. And there's no, under any circumstances, predictions can be rather foolish. But I think we can, through our vantage points as newsmen, through our experiences of the past 4 years and our reactions to the signals that have been raised through statements, actions, and a rare interview, draw some probabilities, or at least possibilities, for the 4 years ahead. So, for openers, a simple little question. What do you think will be the principal characteristics of the second Nixon administration? Oh, in 20 words, more or less, Dan.
Well, first, that they will be pretty much what the characteristics of the first Nixon administration were. And they will be very much the characteristics of the man himself. We are now, for the first time, I think, in his whole political career, getting a feel for the tone, the texture of Richard Nixon, the man himself. So the next 4 years, the characteristics will be cool, calculating, cautious, disciplined, determined, heavy premium on efficiency and managerial abilities. And the tone of the administration will be as it has been, that of a middle-sized town, Main Street, country club, civic club, church, decent intending, concerned, and pretty far out of touch with the wrong side of the tracks.
Dan Shore?
I think the president in domestic policy has rather sounded the keynote for the next 4 years himself. It's going to be more discipline, less permissiveness, more make it on your own, and less help from the government, more saving of the dollar and less saving of federal programs. In a way, I guess, you could sum it up by reference to what's happened in the magazine field. Life died, and money was born, and time marches on.
Eric?
You know, Walter, there's a new book out called When in Doubt, Mumble. I may mumble all through this hour. I'm a very poor prophet about these things. There was a time, of course, very few weeks ago, when what historians are always fond of calling an era of good feeling seemed to be a reasonable prospect. Peace was at hand. The president had a big victory at the polls. Maybe there's still some chance of this if we get a quick settlement in Vietnam. But all the present signs seem to be of a lot of abrasiveness, a lot of tension ahead between the administration, Congress, press, and a more authoritarian cast of mind and action and speech by this administration. We'll know more, you know, when we get the inaugural budget and the State of the Union. That's when we should be talking.
Well, we probably have a chance to talk again, at least another year, Eric. Charles?
Well, I would think that, echoing Dan Rather, that because of the president's past history, his personal predilections, and the hard facts of international life, that foreign policy is going to be one of the great preoccupations of President Nixon's next 4 years. There are a number of urgent problems, economic, political, and defense, which have to be dealt with one way or another. And the effect of the war in Vietnam, settled or unsettled, and even its aftermath, will have a major impact on the success of American policy abroad.
Well, Charles, speaking of Vietnam, let's go right back to you. You are in Paris because of the resumption of the Le Duc Kissinger talks. What about those talks today and their first session of the renewed talks? Anything happen at all that you can get your finger on?
Well, it was a rather frigid atmosphere today, as you might expect. None of the jovial optimism which characterized last month's meetings between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. The North Vietnamese didn't even open the door. They were the hosts at their place of meeting today. For Kissinger, he finally had to make his own way in. There were no handshakes, no smiles, or the rest. On the other hand, they are meeting again. And they're going to meet again tomorrow. They met for 4.5 hours today. Both Le Duc Tho and Kissinger arrived and made quite moderate statements, the only public statements that they've made or are likely to make for a while when they arrive. The experts, so-called, the American side, led by Ambassador William Sullivan, have been meeting all last week, very intensively, 7.5 hours one day. The expectation is that they're doing business. The feeling here is that after what's happened in Hanoi and Haiphong, you can hardly expect the North Vietnamese to go out of their way to show cordiality to the United States. Nevertheless, because they are meeting, there is a presumption that both the North Vietnamese and the United States do want to wind up this war. And therefore, if one were to hazard odds, which is very risky, one could say that the chances of a settlement in the near future are still a little better than even.
Well, that's an interesting set of odds for us, Charles. 51 to 49. Put a figure on it. Dan Rather, what about the view around the White House on that? Would you agree with Charles?
Well, everyone around the White House is extremely cautious, given that this is a cautious group of people and a cautious administration. Super caution has been the word ever since the October 26th statement, peace is at hand. Peace is at hand, that statement has become, for Dr. Kissinger personally and for the Nixon administration, the rough equivalent of what I am backing Thomas Eagleton 1,000% was for George McGovern. They simply have not been able to outlive it. There is a feeling that if there is a way that it can be done, that the president would do almost anything to get a settlement by Inauguration Day. That's just a feeling about it. I want to reemphasize what Eric said before, that I think all of us have been humbled by how lousy our prophecies have been in the past, and I'm not predicting peace by then, but it's a matter of fact that President Nixon wants to get it as soon as he can. One thing we might ask Charles here is whether he picks up anything in Paris about what is now past the rumor stage and into the fact stage, the difficulties between President Nixon himself and Dr. Kissinger. There's no question in Washington now that that is a fact. We don't know many of the details. For example, there was a month period where Dr. Kissinger and the president were barely speaking to one another in a personal sense. Did you pick any of that up, Charles?
Well, the only thing that you pick up, Dan, is by inference. For instance, when he arrived last night, I went out along with approximately 200 other correspondents to watch him arrive. He made a great point of saying, the president has sent me back to make one more major effort to reach peace. This continued emphasis on the president as his director would lead you to think that perhaps Kissinger wanted to indicate that he was not completely his own master in these talks, whether to the public or to the Vietnamese.
I think the same thing was noted in the press conference.
If there's anything in those small signs and portents, this was true of the two famous Kissinger press conferences this fall. In the first one, peace is at hand, there wasn't much reference to the president. Seemed to come straight from Henry's own feelings very much. The second one, when it was bad, many references to the president.
Doesn't this raise the question, then, if on Vietnam for the last couple of months the president has not been listening to Dr. Kissinger, at least I'm saying I accept it as a matter of fact that he hasn't been listening to Dr. Kissinger as much as he did before, which is something new. And in looking forward to the next 4 years, we need to ask ourselves, well, if he isn't listening to Dr. Kissinger, to whom is he listening?
What is your answer to it? I'm sure that you raised it with an answer in mind.
Well, with a guess in mind. Now, here we're on very thin ice. I have to preface this by saying I don't know, but the evidence is very strong that any time the really big decisions are to be made over the next several years, the same people will be around President Nixon as were around him in the first 4 years. And they include still John Mitchell, although he is much out of sight in terms of public visibility. My impression is he's still very much around when such things as do we or do we not buy this deal in Paris is decided. Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Governor Reagan, as I understand, was the first man the president had called when the decision was made to go to China. I think that Governor Reagan had a hand in this last decision. John Connally, I think, had a hand in this last decision. H.R. Bob Haldeman, the president's personal assistant, is still around. Those are the men whose opinions count the most, have counted the most in the past, and I think will for the foreseeable future.
But what are you speaking of when you say in this last decision? Which decision?
The decision, frankly, to pull the rug from under Dr. Henry Kissinger when he returned from Paris. Now, that may be too strong, but the impression is left, and the evidence is getting to be fairly strong now, that when Kissinger said on October 26th that peace was at hand, he indeed thought that it was. That had been led to believe that it was by the president. The president either changed his mind and or had a few reservations, and we began to consult with other people other than Kissinger. Then he decided, no, this is not the deal to accept. That someone convinced him that to accept that deal would be a thinly camouflaged surrender, and he isn't going to have it.
Isn't it possible, Dan, that he convinced himself that he made this decision on his own?
Possible, but again, based on the past, not likely that he made that decision.
Well, are you suggesting, Dan, that the decision was made in Washington in that sort of second thought consultation with friends and advisors rather than because of the intransigence of South Vietnam's President Thieu, which is what I had thought was the stumbling block that caused the recasting their plans?
Well, certainly the intransigence of Thieu was not any help. But again, the strong impression based on the evidence is that any time the president thinks he can get an agreement, has an agreement out of the North Vietnamese, that he, the president, sees as being something short of camouflage surrender, that it doesn't matter what President Thieu thinks, but it does matter what John Mitchell, John Connally, Governor Reagan, H.R. Haldeman think.
Could I suggest, Walter, that the intransigence of President Thieu could be accepted as a given in this situation? The important thing was how much weight was the president going to give to it, considering that he had an agreement virtually sewed up. Between President Thieu and the President of the United States, at some point, there are influences brought to bear, which may be Mitchell, John Connally, and others. But what the President appeared to be hearkening to more than he was hearkening to the specific situation in Vietnam was his own position with the people that he considers to be important, with the wing of the Republican Party that he considers to be important. I don't think there was anything new that the President discovered about this almost completed agreement, but there was a perception that there were enough people important to him in this country who might be against it, who might make it look as though he had gone back on a philosophy, on a belief in what a peace with honor was, to simply make him flinch at the last moment.
We should add the Joint Chiefs of Staff to that list of people who helped convince him.
I think we're doing an awful lot of reading of tea leaves here, frankly.
No
I think our difficulty...
Isn't that the purpose?
I'm afraid it is. I think our difficulty talking about the immediate...
What people can't see is their crystal ball mounted right under them.
Talking about the immediate future ahead, when we don't even know the real facts, the immediate past. But if we're going to speculate, let's speculate on what happens if these talks don't get anywhere. There are many things were put out by the administration through favorite columnists and others that if Hanoi won't deal the way the president wants him to deal in this go-around, he'll go back to heavy bombing, physical punishment. Does anybody at this table really think he can do that now?
I think he can and will.
You do, really?
I do.
I don't. I can't really believe it's possible.
I'm not sure.
What is the restraint? Charles?
No. I was just going to say, I'm not sure that you can say he will. I think you can say he might. There are various other things possible open to him, options of escalation that he can go. He can wipe out Hanoi if he wants to. He can hit the dikes, which has been advised for a long time. And there's the ultimate use of nuclear weapons. But to get back to who's responsible for the breakdown of the talks here, I can't speak to personalities in Washington who may or may not have influence on the president, but I would think that it's Walter's original intuition is quite right, that President Thieu from Saigon provided the ammunition, he provided the arguments which caused the president and his advisors, if you wish, to doubt the validity of the agreement. Now, even as he arrived on Saturday, Le Duc Tho said there are still really only a very few things left to be settled. Some of those are formulas of words, and some of them are formulas of substance. But they are not formulas which skilled negotiators, as they are here, with a will to reach a settlement, could not surmount.
I'd like to ask you something, Eric, that you said just a moment ago, and I want to come back to you, Charles, in a moment on that nuclear thing you dropped in there, almost with as much explosive power as the weapon itself. Eric, this whole matter you're believing that he would not go back to bombing, what would be the restraint if he was willing to do it in the first place and over Christmas and all of that. Well, why would he feel restrained in going back again?
Well, I think the reaction has been probably more powerful than they suspected. It wasn't a case of the Cambodian incursion. It shook them up tremendously in the White House. No matter what they said publicly, as Kissinger said privately, this is a traumatic experience. He's got to govern here. He's got to get along with press, public, and Congress to some degree. To go back to urban bombing on a mass basis after all this, most of our allied friends abroad, in formal terms, like the Canadian Parliament, have condemned us. The Congress is feeling extremely upset and bypassed. There is a limit what he can do. I would give, if he did that, I think the next 4 years are going to be terribly difficult for him.
But Eric, not to argue whether it's justifiable or not justifiable, but there's every indication the president and those around him answer that by saying, listen, we just had a referendum on this on November 7th.
No,
we won it by a landslide proportion.
The referendum on November 7th was not on going bombing these cities, killing all these people. The referendum had much more to do with the promise of peace very close around the corner. That's what they thought they were getting.
Charles, is there any real fear in Europe that the president might escalate to the point of using tactical nuclear weapons?
There's fear only in this sense, that the president has become an unknown quantity in Europe. And with this massive agenda of negotiations coming on, they're worrying more and more about it. Now, when I said the possibility of nuclear weapons, I said that as a last resort and not as a likely one. Personally, I would bet against it. But the fact that people even think of this now is a sign of what they take to be a kind of peevishness in the conduct of American foreign policy, in which the acts, the tactics, do not match the high-minded rhetoric, the statements, the official descriptions of American policy. And there's no question about it that there's been an enormous reaction in Europe to the renewal of the bombing over Hanoi and Haiphong, which seemed to Europeans to be out of all proportion to the hitch in the negotiations. Now, in the last few days, 3 separate European figures of considerable importance have said to me quite independently, if this is what President Nixon does, bomb Hanoi and Haiphong, when there are problems in the negotiations, what's he going to do to us in the years to come when we're going to have very difficult negotiations? Now, they know he's not going to bomb them, but what they're afraid of is the kind of arm-twisting and heavy-handed, rough, tough diplomacy that Secretary Connolly displayed at the time of the dollar crisis in August 1971.
And that's exactly what they'll get when it comes to those negotiations.
Well, that's why when Kissinger speaks of 1973 as the year of Europe, they're somewhat concerned. I think they're glad that the United States is finally going to pay attention to some of these problems over here, but they're a little bit afraid of how it's going to handle them.
What effect does that have on our future negotiations with them? They still will be negotiating with us with greater cohesion on the European community side as against the United States, less of a spirit of alliance. What happens, Charles?
Well, I tell you, it changes the climate as much as it does the physical or logical progress of ideas. The climate is that the United States is now a rather unpredictable quantity, still having this enormous power economically, diplomatically, militarily, above all. So they don't quite know what to make of the new administration. There are a lot of new faces in it. There are a lot of new faces over here in the people who are going to have to administer this or handle the negotiations. It's going to be a while before the new European common market shows any great degree of cohesion. But except for the absolutely essential matters of sorting out the values of every country's money, Vietnam, if it goes on for a long while, is going to have a poisonous effect on the negotiations.
What effect is it going to have on our relations with Russia and China?
Well, they've been very quiet. It may be that the greatest stroke of good fortune that the United States had was that this possibility, this opening of peace, came at a time when the Russians had a bad harvest, and when, for their own reasons, the Chinese wanted to reach outward to the rest of the world. So far, the reactions from Russia and China have been that they would rather preserve their newfound contacts and relationship, the détente with the United States, than to go all out in support of North Vietnam, which doesn't mean they're going to abandon North Vietnam at all. It just means that they aren't going to throw everything behind North Vietnam's effort.
Well, turning to domestic affairs in this look at the Nixon administration 4 years ahead, in his interview with the Washington Star-News, the president said he thought that government had become too big, too expensive. He planned to cut it back. Other presidents have said that, almost from time immemorial, I think. The question is, can this president do it?
Well, yes, Walter, I think this president can do it because, unlike other presidents, this one is willing to sacrifice a great many things to get it done. If you want to do all the same things, it's very difficult to cut it back. The president has made it rather clear that he's willing to do fewer things. There are programs that date back to the 60s, the Great Society, Kennedy-Johnson programs, that he is ready to phase out. It happens to go along with his desire to cut $10 billion out of current spending and hold down the next budget anyway. So that he also happens to believe that too much power and responsibility has gravitated to the federal government. He wants to give that all back to state and local government. Let me insert parenthetically, the reason these things gravitated to the federal government is that they were either not being done well or not being done at all by state and local government. But he's willing to let them try again. He has said in a statement that there is no program, no matter how meritorious on its own, that is worth going ahead with if it's going to mean more inflation. That was what I meant when I said that the dollar and saving the dollar and its value has become more important to him than any program. I think there's going to be a series of horrendous cuts, some of which have already been signaled in the field of water pollution, housing, model cities, education. And I think we're going to be in for something which can be called in the old way belt tightening, but it's going to be like sort of tightening the belt for some people to the bone.
Well, will Congress go along with that?
Congress will, well, in two parts. Congress itself has to agree with the idea of cutting, because if you don't agree with that, then you get blamed for raising taxes, which the administration has promised not to do and which Congress doesn't want to do. The way it's done, however, poses a constitutional problem. The president is not only bringing in a tighter budget, he is also cutting, impounding is the word, money that Congress has already ordered him to spend. They admit in Congress they must have a system of their own for holding appropriations to a certain ceiling, but until they find that system, they're not going to sit there, they say, and let the president do what they consider to be their constitutional prerogative, and that is decide what are the programs, what are the things that get done in this country. And I think we are headed there. On that alone, we have one suit already over the Highway Trust Fund involving Missouri and a whole bunch of senators, and I think we're going to see not only suits, but a clash of which one symptom may be a very small symptom, that the freshman Senator Alvarez was threatening to introduce a bill to cut off money to the White House as a kind of a reprisal.
But nobody at the White House thinks that they're going to cut off money, that Congress is going to get really tough about cutting off money to anything, including even the war. I mean, the view of this president, and it's fair to say of his predecessors for that matter, is that Congress on such subjects as this is, there are a lot of talk, but not very much action. Now, there's no question that what we're looking ahead to, certainly for the foreseeable future in this second Nixon administration, is a lot of bitter battles with Congress. But the power of the presidency has grown so tremendously in my lifetime and yours that any battle he really sets his mind to with Congress, he can win with the will and know-how to do it. Well, this president has both the will and the know-how.
I will grant you that, and I think that goes without debate. But I think the question of whether it's the president or Congress ignores the fact that there's a very big public to which both of which eventually will have to be responsive. I think that as the bad news begins to come, it's already started in the rural areas. There are programs very dear to farmers that already have been stopped. The builders are beginning to hear what's going to happen to model cities and to urban renewal and to subsidize housing. And the net impact of all of this as it gets around the country is going to let loose the third house of our government, and that is the house of public opinion. Now, it's true, the president has no further election battles to fight. He can now go back to his own philosophical roots and do what he wanted to do all along, carry out the ideas he wanted to do. But yet, in the end, I feel that somehow, when it gets down to the country, and if they don't like it, they will be heard from, and if they are heard from, there will be changes made.
Eric?
Well, I think the country's going to be heard from very loudly if you have to raise taxes sharply, or if this inflation continues as it is. And this is what he's got in mind. The fact is about Congress that I have a lot of sympathy for them. I think they are in something of a constitutional crisis, as Mansfield and others call it, in terms of their powers vis-a-vis the other branch of the government. But it's their own fault to a great extent. It's too unwieldy. It is archaic. Now, over 12 years now, the last 12, the Congress has cut taxes by $45 billion. It has increased expenditures around $135 billion. So we're in serious trouble. It's simply not possible to go on adding very much to the federal bureaucracy. The built-in costs now, pay raises, an extraordinary series of them, military and civilian, when projected, are frightening every statistician in Washington, can practically break the back of everything. You either raise taxes sharply or you sharply reduce the cost of government. Now, what you going to do? I don't think there's a real middle way, because down the road, if this inflation continues, these deficits, which are prodigious, continue. The balance of payments deficit continues, and it may get worse because we need gas and oil. Down the road to this lies a bust.
Is the American public ready to drop these programs, however, at this time? The social legislation that we've seen grow up over the last 40 years almost since Franklin Roosevelt. Willing to drop this?
Some of it, but I wish I would, money is wasted terribly in HEW, but money is wasted terribly in the Pentagon. I think most people would prefer to see waste, if there must be waste, in the effort to help people live, and rather than the effort to kill people. He said very little about the military. The costs of the military are down in comparative terms, in terms of real money, over some years ago. But they're going to, in absolute figures today, they're going to jump up a bit, about $4 billion, because of the built-in pay and allowance increases. I still think that McGovern had a lot of truth with him. The business of big cuts in the military over the next few years.
Well, it's visceral that these things we know from over the past 4 years, that it's visceral with this president, that he cares. In domestic policy, that what he cares about most, I'm tempted to say about the only thing he cares about. Fighting inflation, keeping the deficits down, and banking what he sees as berserk bureaucracies, particularly those dealing with sociology. Now, it's very easy, given that strong feeling on his part, and whatever is necessary in this second term, to try to put his feelings into effect. He's going to do, howls from the farmers notwithstanding. Now, this may or may not be a wise policy, but this is the policy. It's very easy, those being his feelings, to picture this president as completely lacking in compassion, not caring about the blind, the lame, the halt, the black, by cutting back these HEW programs. Now, I must say that he in private and those around him make a very strong case for saying that in the long run, if he succeeds in what he's doing, that these are going to be the very people who benefit most, because we're going to be able to get more value per dollar out of what we spend on them.
Well, he also suggests that, as with children, if we are permitted to live in this fashion that we have on welfare, we're never going to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. But that hasn't really been proved out in past sociological experiments that it works out that way. There may be a great backlog of feeling across the United States to get rid of these heavy welfare expenses and the expenses of the big cities and so forth. But and the fact of the matter is that somebody's going to have to do this job, basically. We're not going to have people living and dying in the streets of our cities.
That is exactly right. When the president talks of cutting the federal budget and turning responsibilities back to the states and localities with a certain amount of revenue sharing, then if it isn't spent here, then a lot of it is going to be spent there. And money spent by the state is also an inflationary factor, however much smaller the federal budget may look. And but I cannot conceive of just how this thing is going to work out. I cannot conceive. The president says we have enough on our plate, and he doesn't want new programs. And that may, to some extent, be true. Certainly the country has given a feeling of, yes, we've gone awful fast with experimentation in the past 10 years. Let's slow down now. But there are distinctions to be drawn. There is a difference between cutting government by making it more efficient and cutting government by cutting out the things government does. And there is a difference between keeping and improving present programs and starting a whole bunch of new programs. And we've been talking about them all as though they're all the same thing, as though if you cut government and cut programs and don't start new programs, this all adds up to cutting bureaucracy. Cutting bureaucracy by cutting what government is there to do is not a saving, except at the expense of people who benefit from those
Well, it's
programs.
a saving in this sense, that what President Nixon is saying, whether you agree with it or not, I'm not here to argue. I'm trying to translate what I understand to be his basic philosophy. It is to say, it is a fact in his mind that the liberalism of the 30s and 40s and 60s in this country is bankrupt. He wants to put it in a receivership. And he is saying, in effect, yes, Mr. Shore, many of these programs are worthwhile. And when you can show me, when someone from HEW can show me where we are getting value for dollar on these programs, I will continue that program. But the onus of proof is on HEW, that I'm no longer going to accept OEO and HUD and HEW simply coming in and asking for these tremendous sums of money.
We're talking about hospitals. We're talking about hospital construction. We're talking about this enormous shortage of housing for the poor and where these people are going to live. We're talking about a moratorium which may be announced any day now on building of subsidized housing. We're not talking about frills. The president, it has to be noted, has made it perfectly clear, if I may borrow one of his phrases, that he believes that people should have more responsibility for doing things themselves and should not be helped so much. That springs from very deep. The president has written and spoken about that a long time. He now intends to translate that into action. If it works, it will be a great thing. If it doesn't work, it will be not for him or for you or for me, but for a lot of people who are going to be the subject of the noble experiment with go do it yourself, can be an enormous disaster involving great suffering.
Well, now, the president, Eric, we were talking about this a minute ago, but the president is doing most of this so far on his own, and you believe, and I gather that my colleagues here believe, that the Congress is not going to assert itself in this matter and going to let him do this. Is it a good idea that the administration should gather all this power unto itself? Shouldn't there be the traditional system of checks and balances?
I wish there were. If one is critical about the president in terms of this reorganization and bypassing Congress, then you're accused of being an anti-Nixon liberal or something. But to take that position is to take that conservative, traditionalist, constitutionalist position. I don't like to see great institutions and the great concept put out of balance this much. I'm not terribly upset about his attempts to reorganize the administrative agencies. He asked Congress to move in that direction. In fact, Johnson did. Well, I know you are. You always are. But Johnson tried it. The system is too cumbersome. I think I'd rather see him go with this and see how it works. To be sure, there are not going to be any naysayers around him. There are not going to be any individualists, the Hickles, Romneys, or other, the kind of people Roosevelt had around. And that's going to make it awful dull and rather monolithic. But something has to give somewhere. And until Congress
That
really...
does make it efficient, though, doesn't it?
It might. Who knows? I think he has the right to try it. Certainly has the right to try it. A lot of experiments have got to be made. But Congress had better do some experimenting. You now have a situation in Congress. Of course, they can't keep up with the president. Not only because there's a war on, and in wartime a president always has greater freedom, the Congress much less, but because of the way the thing works. You've got one set of men who decide the taxes. You've got another set over here who decide how much we spend. That twain doesn't really meet. They're not even computerized. They have no facilities for doing this. You can't run the smallest private business that way. And the thing is out of their hands. They're bankrupt in terms of method. They know that. They've had many hearings recently that Dias, Stevenson, and others have tried to do. which comes first here, I don't know. But the president obviously isn't going to wait. He's going to go ahead and do this. He's only got 4 years.
Well, why do you disagree that with this plan for reorganization of the executive?
Risking Eric's wrath and agreeing that it may be more efficient if it's done by the president, and especially now that he's created a kind of a super cabinet in the White House, in which a great deal of the power from the cabinet has been drawn into the White House with his presidential assistants and higher than other cabinet officers, plus the fact that a great many people from the White House have been sent to the departments to keep track of them. It becomes more efficient. But the cabinet departments, by and large, represent constituencies around the country, sectors of the public. And you get a great deal of fray because you're getting people who are representing different groups. And you say that holds you up. You want something more responsive to the president. He is the president, elected by all the people, or at least a majority of the low turnout that showed up. You take that into the White House, and you have now a structure that is going to be much more responsive to the president, I think, than anything we've had before. But in the course of being that, is going to be much less responsive to the various groups around the country. When farmers speak through agriculture now, agriculture will be told what to do. If you had HEW speaking for the poor and the black and the sick, now you're going to have coming from the White House. And it's going to be efficient in the sense that there's going to be less dissent and less problem getting it done. But is it going to be democratic?
Well, but it seems to me that the executive department, the efficiency is required. The people ought to be loyal to the president. There's no reason why their disputes, if they have any, should be brought out into the public domain necessarily, but it's up to Congress to represent the people. That's what it's elected for. That's what our checks and balances are for. And it's got to be more efficient, Eric. I agree with you. It's got to work that way, but if we want this thing to work, the system of ours, let's get Congress moving and represent us properly. And let the executive be as efficient as it possibly can be under our bureaucratic system. Gentlemen, we were speaking domestic programs for the next administration, the next 4 years. What about the economy and wage price controls? What's the plan there?
Well, the wage and price controls stay on in modified form for the foreseeable future. Such things are going to ease up on rent controls, ease up on some of, what do they call it then, the profits proof.
Well, probably the most important thing that will happen is that the profit margin test, which has been used in order to get price increases, may be modified, changed, or go out the window altogether. It's the one thing that business doesn't like of many controls that it does like. They'll probably also exempt certain areas, like maybe retail business. They want to slim it down, begin to phase it out, but there is no question that for the rest of this year at least, that the general control over prices and especially over wages will be continued.
The great myth that we've gone through and what we're facing now over the next couple of years is that, first of all, inflation has not been beaten. There's still a very serious problem with inflation in this country. And for that matter, throughout at least the Western world. And President Nixon, in the vernacular of the streets, is hip to this, despite all the rhetoric, and very much concerned about it. Now, here again, I mean, some of us perhaps would say that the greatest domestic problem, the greatest problem facing this society over the long range is race. But President Nixon believes that the greatest problem is economic, basically inflation. And whatever it takes to try to continue slowing the rate of inflation, he's going to do. And that includes keeping on some form of wage and price control.
You mean he sees our main problems as green rather than black?
Those are your words and not mine. I could only say it's very easy to say, well, the president doesn't care, again, about the problems such as black. Their answer to that is something like the answer in those old mining towns. They said, please don't hit the piano player. He's doing the best he can.
Charles, Europe certainly has its share of this problem of inflation, but also they must be concerned about inflation in this country and our economic viability. With the Western European nations now joined by and increased in the economic community, the common market, how do they look upon the United States and our economy?
Well, I've been listening, Walter, to this discussion of the domestic affairs of the United States with the greatest interest, and I suddenly realized that living over here, of course, I do talk to more foreigners than I talk to Americans. Now, as to inflation, the United States is the envy of every country in Western Europe. because however much a danger, and I'm sure it's very real that Dan and Rather and Shore both have mentioned, the United States has been much more successful than any other country in the developed country in the Western world in holding down inflation. And when you were talking about the efficiency of the government, it's the inefficiency of the American government that worries most Europeans. The big problems that are going to come up next year over here, you know, we've got the SALT talks, the security conference, the mutual balanced force reduction things, and they'll go on forever. Nothing much to be done about that. But they'll have to do something about the dollar. Now, the problem is that the United States is now running an unprecedented deficit in its balance of payments. And this is flooding the whole world with unwanted dollars, and somebody has got to sort it out sometime. Now, the United States is attacking this from a negotiating position that the rest of the world should bail us out because we have these problems and because their currencies are wrongly valued, and therefore they must somehow change their currency parity so that the dollar will stand on its own. Needless to say, this does not commend itself to most of our partners in Western Europe, not to mention Japan, although Japan probably will revalue the yen, which it ought to do. But the whole economic problem is going to be, in the next 4 years of the Nixon administration, the world economic problem, currency, monetary problem, is going to be one of the very crucial things that we're going to have to face. The United States is trying to pull this into a comprehensive package because it realizes that here are these countries that are not anxious to help us economically, but at the same time are anxious for our military support, as in NATO and indeed as in the Far East. And it's going to be a very mixed bag, and they're very much afraid that we're going to lean on them pretty hard to bail us out of our dollar difficulties.
Gentlemen, let's move on to another topic which is very dear to all of our hearts, but I think that it's not self-serving for us to bring it up here at all. It has become a matter of great public concern as well as our concern in the press, and that is this administration's attitude toward the press, and particularly perhaps television broadcasting. What do you see, Dan, from the White House as the future course of our relationship, one with the other, the White House and the press generally?
No let-up in sight in the anti-press campaign. Here again, it's one of the things that President Nixon personally believes in very strongly, that he came into office with a very strong bias against the press, feeling that he had been treated unfairly over a long period of time, and seeing this as an indication of the basic unfairness of the press. Now, and when he has other people say for him, he seldom says himself, but when he has other people say for him, what Vice President Agnew has said for so long, and what Clay Whitehead said recently. He believes that. He believes that the press is elitist, liberal, unfair, biased. And it wasn't a case of simply trying to put the press on the defensive for his own re-election possibilities. Unquestionably, that was in the equation. But it runs much deeper than that. Here again, it's in the bone marrow of this president, and he's, with this great mandate that he has over the next 4 years, he's going to continue trying to do something about it.
Walter, may I chime in? This is Charles.
Yes, indeed.
I'm sitting now in a studio of ORTF in France, which is an example of what happens to and I shouldn't be inhospitable to them because they're terribly hospitable to me, and I don't mean to be unkind to them. They're always very good to us. But this is a state-run television system.
Careful, Charles. A lot of them understand English.
Yes, I know they do. But that's all right. They also understand what I'm talking about. It's a state-run television industry and has been ever since de Gaulle was here. It operates in the favor of the government. And all I can say as to what this means is that it would be unthinkable for a discussion such as we're having tonight to be broadcast on French television.
You know, that's a good point, Charles, and there's another one, since we're talking to you in Paris, that the whole image of the United States is affected to a certain degree by this administration crackdown on the press, if you can describe it as such in this country. The International Press Institute issues an annual report on censorship around the world. And for the first time in my memory, and that's a very respectable organization, as you know, with its headquarters in Switzerland, it has nothing to, no hod to carry for any nation, any cause, except freedom of press. And for the first time in my memory, this year, in its annual report, it listed the United States as one of the countries where over the last year, the freedom of speech and press had been threatened and infringed, or the threat was there of infringement, I should say.
But we haven't even mentioned the part that comes through the courts, that in the past couple of years has now become established by the Supreme Court that we can no longer successfully defend the confidentiality of sources or of information. We've had 4 people go to jail for it. One spent a couple of hours of jail in connection with the Watergate case. And so there's a kind of a pincer movement now between the judiciary and the administration that I find really quite alarming.
Well, I don't know why exactly. I can't document it, but I have a kind of a gut feeling that he's gone too far with this, that he can't win on it. More and more congressmen come around to defend the press on this. And a very interesting point is that after many years of the printed press, the newspapers, not worrying about the problems of broadcasters, accepting this argument because of a technological difference in how news and opinion is delivered, therefore the First Amendment could be interpreted differently. As between us, some of us have been trying to tell newspaper people for 20 years this is not so. We're in the same boat. But not until their own ox was gored. With the Pentagon Papers, prior restraint, then with all the subpoenas and the arrests of newspaper reporters, did they begin to change. And when the Whitehead speech about the networks and local stations was made, as far as I can see, most of the printed press of the country has supported our position on this. This is a big change, and I think a very hopeful one.
Well, gentlemen, we can't dwell on that a great deal longer. I think we have raised the question, and we don't have any answers as to just exactly where it's going, except yours, Dan. You're feeling that it's going further. Eric's feeling that perhaps the tide is beginning to turn. And I think we can all hope for the people's sake that Eric is right. Dan, rather, you are wrong.
I'd be perfectly happy to be wrong, as I have so often been wrong in the past.
In summing this discussion of ours up, I'd like to ask each of you again, rather briefly, please, what kind of a society you see in the United States over the next 4 years? Dan Rather?
A society that increasingly questions itself, and if President Nixon has his way, and I think he will to a large degree, a new conservative era moving into place. But you can't close without saying, I think, that you never want to underestimate the American capacity for change and self-renewal. Kindness and decency still are alive and working in very large quantities in this country. A reasoned belief in country and an unreasoning belief in ourselves still is a strong strain in the character of Americans. And this will be a better country over the next 4 years, not because of any president's leadership or lack of leadership, but because of ourselves.
Dan Shore?
Well, this may be perhaps one of my last chances at elitist gossip, so let me enjoy it. Without being too, I don't want to say that we're headed into some kind of deep freeze in government in this country. Maybe that's over-dramatized. But I do sense a kind of a chill coming over government as the administration begins to put into practice what has been the precepts of our president. I sense that there's going to be a slowing down in experimentation, in new thinking, that we're going to work at protecting what we have. That's what the government is going to do with the support of a great many people until some of their oxes get gored. I just see a kind of a rigidity coming in. Government is going to stop and wait for people to go and do their own thing. And if they do their own thing, fine. And if they get lost along the wayside, it's going to be so much the worse for them.
Charles Collingwood?
Well, I tend to see it from the other side of the water, of course. And I see the United States, as I suppose most Europeans and Asiatics, for that matter, see it, continuing to be prosperous, continuing to set standards, rightly or wrongly, which most of the world will follow, but a nation which is in this multipolar world in the process of consolidation rather than continuing to expand its influence. This may be good or bad for the world. It depends a lot on how the president handles foreign affairs in the next 4 years. But I would think one thing would be sure, and that is that in the aftermath of Vietnam, the United States will not be anxious to undertake any more adventurous and dramatic escapades abroad.
Eric?
Well, I guess I'd ended with about as much doubt as I began this hour, Walter. But this country is so constituted that it's perfectly extraordinary how much depends on the notes of the day as they're sounded from Washington, and chiefly that means the presidency. I think Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt were right. The presidency is basically, first of all, an act of moral leadership, not an administrative function. I have a feeling, and I've always felt this way, that the people of this country will try to live up to their own best vision of themselves if they're encouraged to. But that vision must be constantly held up before them. I don't think it really has been. We have had, for too many years now, the vision of America the power. The old vision of America the good has almost been lost, and it has to come back or there'll be no leadership.
Well, I think I have to go along with all of you. We come to virtually, you have 4 different statements there, and they all come to the same thing, that there is great hope for America. The strength is there with the leadership, as Eric suggested. And we all have hope. I have hope that we can become a little more tolerant of each other's foibles and a little less tolerant of those things which are wrong in the world. I don't know whether the policies of the government for fewer programs, social programs, and less government, the way to do it or not, but I think that goodwill is there and will, we at least can hope, prevail. Thank you.